Here's a quote from the latest video dropped by Prighozhin. We conducted the special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, but instead of denazification, we turned Ukraine into a country that the whole world knows about, a new Greek or Roman civilization. It's an extraordinary interview with Prighozhin, and we'll be covering that in more detail in this week's review of the news in Silicon Bites. But in this episode, I'm speaking to an unorthodox journalist who has created some of the most memorable and impassioned coverage of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe if you like our guest speakers, as it helps other people discover the content we create, as well as the many fantastic Ukrainian experts that you can find on the channel. Please also do consider becoming a patron to help support the work of the channel. Now, John Sweeney will not need introduction to everybody, but for those of you who aren't aware of his work, he is a British investigative journalist and writer. He worked for the Observer newspaper and BBC's Panorama and Newsnight series. John ceased working for the BBC in October 2019 and is now reporting on the war in Ukraine, as well as creating a daily war diary, which I strongly advise you to watch if you've not seen it. He'll also be working on a film documenting the most brutal parts of the conflict, the Eastern Front, which is to be released in June this year. And John, welcome to the channel. And that film is probably a great place to start.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, it's called the Eastern Front. And what's interesting about it is that the shooter, producer, director, Colin Robertson, he's in his 20s and he's never been to a war zone before. So every time there's a very loud bang, he jumps a mile, and I stay absolutely still. So does my friend Paul Conroy, who is basically the wheels. And Paul is a wonderful, wonderful former British Army gunner who ended up taking snaps and being silly. He's a great, great war photographer, and famously was seriously injured in Syria when the great Sunday Times reporter and my friend Marie Colvin was killed in Syria. So when the Russian, we're close to the Russian army, but the bangs are made by the Ukrainian army, it's outgoing. So I explained to Kalin, what's happened as ever, something's gone wrong. We're filming in February, and our car, which is a big old kind of SUV, and it's pretty good off-road, but it's not good enough for this deep, deep mud. And basically we get stuck in the mud, and then this kind of artillery barrage dials up, bang! And Kalin jumps a mile, and I go, that's outgoing, that's okay. The difference between outgoing and incoming is this, is that outgoing, it's one sound, and it's okay. Incoming, it's a longer sound because you hear first the explosion and then the thing landing, and if you're lucky, you can feel it through your boots. If you're unlucky, it's worse. It's quite different, and then bang, and anyway. So part of the strange comedy of the film is that the lens, the camera, is held by somebody who's never been through this before, and so people who watched it. There was a little screening at the Frontline Club, and there were apparently, there were cheers at the end, and also people crying. The room seats 50, and there was 100 people in the room, so it captures something. And the other thing, we've got three big stories. The first is the Russian use of terror against civilians. So a big block of flats in Dnipro was hit in January, and they killed 50 people, including 6 kids. And that's a massive working class block of flats, 10 stories high. You put a big rocket the size of a large minibus into that, and you're going to kill people. And Russia has done this again and again and again. And when we go to Dnipro, we happen to bump in the 2 mums with their little kids, and one of the mums was actually filming her kids when the rocket hit. Now, everybody was okay, but this is, they know, her children know, had friends who were killed in that. And when the Russians say they don't target civilians, they're lying. Then we do a story about white phosphorus, which is it's an incendiary bomb which burns about 3,500 degrees centigrade, maybe 2,500 hot. And there is a military use for it. It's for masking sort of troop movements at night, but it's against the rules of war, against the Geneva Convention to use these kind of weapons in against civilians. And we properly documented that happening in Kherson. And thirdly, we documented torture, and we interviewed a torture victim who went back, and this was horrible for him, but he was a brave and good man. And he went back to the torture place in Kherson where he was tortured. And you can visibly see his distress. And there's something else that we also find in a separate torture place. We find gas masks. And this is called the slom. I'm sure you know this elephant. So the old Soviet gas mask is green, but the corrugated nozzle looks like an elephant trunk. So the Russian nickname for it is the slom, the elephant. And and in this awful place, there are lots of gas masks without the filter. The filter's been taken off. And I first heard about the slom 23 years ago when I did a radio documentary for the BBC about the Russian army's use of torture against civilians. So I first came across this particular torture device 23 years ago.
And that'd be Chechnya, the first Chechen war or the second? Or
second, so yeah. 2000. And it was, so the evidence that Russia uses torture in a systematic way is overwhelming. In my own experience, 23 years ago, I cover the second Chechen war. I go to Chechnya, and they tell me, young Chechen lads tell me about the slom. And 23 years on, I see these elephant masks discarded in the basement of the police station in Kherson, where terrible things have happened. And separately, one of my fixers has heard this directly from the Ukrainian investigators, war crimes investigators in Izium, which is a different place, but they're using that again. Absolutely no doubt in my mind, but they use torture on a whole-scale basis, and it's systematic, it's industrial. So we made the film because there are useful idiots in the West, and the most terrifying and most powerful is, of course, Donald Trump, who believe the Kremlin's stupid narrative, their dark fairy tales. And so we've made the film, and we took the risks to life and limb, simply to say to these people, the Russian propaganda machine, the Russian lying factory, is lying to you. It's lying about not targeting civilians. It's lying about not using banned weapons. It's lying about not torturing people. Boy, does it do all three big time.
And lying about its motivations for the war. And this, I think, is one of the most frustrating things. I went to a talk yesterday that was organized by Edward Lucas, and it was about grey zone aggression. And they will utilize information. They will use ridiculous pantomime narratives that you think, well, how's that going to work? But they also use narratives that do work with many people. And we'll come to the BBC in a minute, because, dare I say, even on mainstream media, Russian narratives creep in. I heard one on Times Radio yesterday, the continued use of the word escalation, the continued use of the idea that if Ukraine engages in PSYOPs or the Belgorod exercise that we're seeing, that somehow that is wrong and immoral. I mean, Ukraine is fighting for its life and needs to use every tool that it can do to survive, and Ukrainian lives are precious. So why shouldn't they use every single tactic in the book? But you get these all sorts of, I would almost call them appeasing phrases and narratives, even throughout mainstream media, even after however many months of torture, aggression, and uncivilized behavior we see on the part of Russia.
No, absolutely right, Jonathan. The problem is that for 23, I first called Vladimir Putin a war criminal 23 years ago when I saw the evidence of of torture, and I saw the evidence of fuel air bombs, which are banned against civilians in Chechnya. And I think I was viewed as an eccentric nutter. And I can remember, certainly when I was at the BBC, I was astonished and I did a panorama about the poisoning with polonium-210 of Alexander Litvinenko. But the consequence was the four Russian diplomats were expelled from London. And all that means, so Litvinenko was a British subject. He was murdered, poisoned, the cruelest, most barbaric way. An awful lot of Londoners were, remains a serious possibility that they may have in some way got contaminated by the polonium. And the British government expels 4 Russian spies, which means that Putin has to print 4 new diplomatic passports. And then the same thing in 2018. And the same thing in 2014 with the shooting down of MH17. Yeah. So on what I would say to the Kremlin's useful idiots, quite a few of whom are in Britain, you have, by your timidity and your lack of understanding of the nature of Vladimir Putin and his regime and what he has turned Russia into, you are doing something and the Ukrainians are paying for it in their blood. So shame on these people. When they talk about escalation, what are they talking about? Escalating to what? I mean, I first saw my first dead Ukrainian child more than a year ago, in March, early March 2022, and this was a 5-year-old girl who had been blown up by a Russian bomb that missed the Kyiv TV tower and hit a row of shops. And I was the first reporter into the TV complex the next morning, and I saw the people from the morgue take an old man, child's mother, and the dead child away to the morgue. I saw them put the blankets on the corpses. And Russia says, we don't target civilians. Fuck off. Fuck off. And the idea of escalation, Ukraine is fighting a war like Britain fought a war against Nazi Germany. And if you don't understand that, there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong.
And we took the gloves off. I mean, we didn't have sort of red lines. We did, well, we can't bomb this, we can't go there, we can't do that. And if you're fighting for your survival.
Yes. So the heavy decisions were, for example, sinking the French Navy, because at that point, the French political and military leadership were in bed with the Nazis. And Churchill had a big decision. I've forgotten that. I think it's called Abu Kub. If I'm damn certain I'll give some kind of Nelson era name to the battle. But basically, Churchill said, no, we've got to sink the French Navy. Bang, and we sank it. The worst, hardest decisions are, how do you prevent the Nazis from stopping the Normandy invasion? You bomb the hell out of all of the French railway lines. And that meant that the RAF killed, I don't know, 10, 20,000 innocent French civilians. But they did it for a reason. Now, that's not an escalation. It's because Hitler started the war, and then we had to win it. And then, having won it, France was, in the process, France was liberated. But that is the nature of fighting a war. So that the idea that Ukraine is behaving badly while its citizens are being murdered, while the capital, and I'm in Kyiv, and pretty much every night there's some elderly Russian ironmongery comes flying in the air, and it gets knocked out by Ukrainian air defense. But the idea that for Ukraine to fight back, like with all its power, is somehow wrong.
And with its hands tied behind its back. I mean, to an extent, I'm going to, this is a conversation I'm going to have with Operator Starsky this evening, actually. So 2 fantastic conversations today. But throughout this war, I mean, not only did we fail to rearm Ukraine and fail to even give them defensive weapons after the invasion of Crimea, we've delayed and stalled all the way through this year to the point now where F-16s potentially are going over, but they're not going to arrive in time to really have any effect on the so-called spring offensive.
Yeah.
And
So
we've continuously, put these restrictions in place.
It's disastrous because and this is across the whole Western world, but what's happened is that we have shuffled our bottoms too slowly, and the Ukrainians are in a problem in that if they launch their offensive without, what they want to do is to hit Russia very hard once, and then the Russian army leaves Ukraine. The problem is the kit, in particular the F-16s and the Abrams tanks, because of American timidity, isn't arriving in time. So the dilemma facing the Ukrainians, number one, they strike and it goes off at half cock, or they wait. And if they wait, that means that more of their citizens will be tortured, more of their children will be deported, stolen from Ukraine. This isn't kids who live in occupied Ukraine. These children will be stolen and sent to Russia. God knows what fate. So the moral jeopardy facing Ukraine because of our lack of speed and enterprise. So it's like watching, you imagine on your beach and you see a child start drowning, and then you go, should I go and try and save this, or maybe a dad trying to save his child, they're in trouble. Should I go and try and save these people, or should I, open another bottle of Sauvignon Blanc?
Yeah, finish the movie I'm watching and then maybe think about it. And there's another calculation which Ukrainian army have to think about, but the Russian army doesn't, and that is being profligate with lives. I think what's apparent throughout this conflict is that the Ukrainians believe in the sanctity of life, the value of the individual, and they seem to be guiding their military strategies to, as far as possible, preserve the lives of their troops and their scarce resources. The Russians have clearly no such concern.
Yeah, and by the way, this is completely standard. You hang out with the Johnson, you hang out with the Ukrainian army. I don't know if you know the story, but on day 2 of the war, I was arrested by this Ukrainian soldier because he thought I was a Russian spy. And I went, "Do I look like a Russian spy?" And he goes, "Give me your passport." And I said, "You're not a policeman." And he lifts up his AK and points it directly at me. And okay. And then as I'm led to the little command post, and I'm on my own, and it's a bit scary. I just said, "Can you just look at my Twitter banner? Can you just Google me?" Anyway, that everybody's super paranoid, everybody's super suspicious, and eventually they call the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence, and I'm booked into the SBU headquarters. They're going to investigate me and check me out. And only then does this guy, his name is Vladimchenko, only then does this guy say, "Look," and he sees, "You've challenged Vladimir Putin." "Yes, I've challenged Vladimir Putin. I used to work for BBC Panorama." "And you've challenged Donald Trump. He's walking away from it." "Yes, I've challenged Donald Trump." And then this guy looks at me and he has a great big broad smile and he says, "I think you have an interesting story." So now, then his name's Vladimchenko. He's been fighting in the Bakhmut area the last few days. We've become great friends. He and I, whenever he's back from the front, we have a few beers. We have lots and lots of beers. I've been to Bakhmut 7 times last year. Not this year. Every time I went there, it got worse and worse. December was the worst time. But in August, I went there for 5 days on the trot. I was actually staying with Vlad's unit. And at one point, we went to the trench, and the Russian army is possibly between 1 and 5 kilometers away. So at the most 3.5 miles. So they're close. And I'm in a trench. And then somebody hands me a cup of tea. And on the tea, Vlad says, it says, best Ukrainian grandma. And I'm with an American pal of Vlad and mine, Chris Orkichoni, who's a great, great photographer. And Chris says, hey, John, you can be a grandma if you want to be. That's why Ukraine is fighting this war. And we're all giggling. And that's the kind of Ukrainian army vibe, which is, you know, if you can tell a joke in a trench, you're going to do that. And they, Vlad says, like, when we lose people, we go out and get them back. And the Russians don't give a damn about their dead because it's a horrible, brutal army. It's like, it's a gangster's army. Nobody cares if one of the under gangsters, the lowly gangsters are killed. Nobody cares. The Ukrainian army, Vlad actually went out on a special mission, like for a mile in no man's land, heavy risk themselves, to bring back the corpse of one of their comrades so that his poor mother had a body to bury. And my friend, I don't agree with his politics, but he's a friend of mine, Johnny Mercer, who's now in the cabinet for veteran affairs, but came out to Kyiv. He was the first MP to come out to Kyiv, and he saw me, recognized me, and he said, shh, you know, I'm not here. And I said, I know you're not here, but by the way, there's a bar, the Buena Vista. I'll show you where it is, and let's go for a drink later. And Johnny's a really good bloke. I should point out that I didn't have a flak jacket, or rather I had a flak jacket with no ceramic plates front and back, which means it's like walking around with a smoking jacket. You need the plates. And his producer, Lev Wood, who's a bloody good guy too, he gave his plates, or his flak jacket to me, so I had a proper flak jacket with plates. Wonderful. Johnny said, an army that abandons its dead pretty much always loses to the army that looks after its dead. And absolutely that's true. So there is a tremendous humanity about the Ukrainian army. I mean, I'm not, this isn't bullshit. I know these people. I mean, Vlad arrested me on day 2, for God's sake. but that's kind of standard. And when you know, hang, I mean, obviously there are bad people in any army, or there are bad situations. That's true. But generally, the morale of the Ukrainian army is, I mean, I've been a war reporter since '88, and I have never, ever been with an army with such self-belief. It is massive. They really, really believe in what they're doing, and they do it with humanity, and they look after their own people. And I'm sure there are exceptions to this, but by and large, they look after the Russian prisoners because it's better for them that the Russians surrender, and then they can trade them. And everybody in the machinery knows that.
And pick up equipment and potentially other things as well. Because again, one feature of the Russians is not just do they profligate with their people's lives, they seem to abandon equipment at the drop of a hat.
Well, there's a very simple reason for this, Jonathan. Ukrainians are fighting for their homes, and they're fighting for their loved ones who are trapped behind enemy lines. That's a really powerful motivation. It means they have great morale. The Russians have been told a lie by Putin. By the way, so we're all clear. I did Russian at school, and then I've forgotten it all. Ya glupy nom, извини, я говорю по-русски, как испанская корова. I speak Russian like a Spanish cow. Ya glupy gnome, I'm a stupid gnome. These are just silly joke, laugh phrases. My accent's terrible.
How's your Ukrainian though? How's your Ukrainian coming along?
Putin, Julio. Putin's a dickhead. But I love Russia. I love Russian literature. I was incredibly excited when I went to Russia and all of that. However, after a year and a half of this bloody, stupid, awful war, I'm bitterly disappointed by the failure of civil Russian society to really, really challenge Putin. And so there is, I knew Anna Politkovskaya, and she warned that what Putin was doing in 2003 was that he was zombifying Russia. And to to a horrible extent, her prophecy has come true. And Putin at the moment is leading a nation of zombies to commit mass murder. And so if anyone calls me a Russophobe, I will say, no, that's not true. But there is the Russia I was studying, I was learning the language, and I studied the politics when I was at university in the 70s. It was, embalmed in the dying Soviet Union, but actually it is a less awful place than it is now.
Absolutely. And I think people, if they watch quite a few of the videos here, not only was the Soviet Union more, socially sophisticated, there were far fewer political prisoners, far less sort of everyday sort of hassle and terror than you have now.
Towards the end. Towards the end. So remember, so like in the reach of history, obviously Stalin. Here's the problem: is that Stalin's evil was never properly washed away in a way that after the Nazis were defeated, there was a serious attempt in West Germany to de-nazify the country. Now, it wasn't perfect, and you can have an argument about it, but that did happen. When Yeltsin took over, there was an opening, a flowering of civil society in Russia, but it wasn't a de-Stalinization. So people like Putin and Putin's bosses back then in the 70s had been allowed to get away with mass murder, and everybody could remember that. Everybody's Russian grandma will remember the terror. And so therefore, so there is a problem with the legacy there. But it's also absolutely true. Last time one of the times I was in Moscow, I can remember my fixer saying that one of the older dissidents said it's far worse under Putin than it was under Brezhnev and then the geriatrics. More of my friends, said this guy, have been shot under Putin than were locked up under the old system. And so this is something that the useful idiots in the West, and there's an awful lot of them. And by the way, there are some dire useful idiots. Peter Hitchens, Donald Trump. One is Trump is far more powerful than Hitchens, but nevertheless, I was on a discussion on Radio Northern Ireland, Radio Ulster, BBC Radio Ulster yesterday, and Hitchens was full of nonsense about how horrible war is. Yeah, but Putin started it, and Putin can stop it by leaving. But yes, of course, war is horrible. I know that. But at the same time, my father fought in the Second World War in the Battle of the Atlantic to help defeat Nazi Germany, and he was a ship's engineer on a tanker bringing oil to Britain for Hurricanes and Spitfires. Now, and those machines were there to kill Nazi airmen. But there was a reason for that, because they were trying to invade Britain. So
this is something Ukrainians understand, isn't it? Ukrainians understand even now in a way that I think many in the West still don't understand, is that if Ukrainian town is occupied, then anybody who has an association with the army, anyone who has a relative in the army, anyone who's been in the civil administration, the intellectual elite, writers, poets, teachers, at worst, at best, they'll be tortured. At worst, they'll be liquidated. And this isn't, an accident. This is a strategy which has echoes throughout, the Soviet past.
Yes. I've written this book called Killer in the Kremlin, which sets out a lot of this stuff. But I have just completed, he's showing a copy. Very nice, very good, lovely. Thank you, Jonathan. But I've also just completed Ghosting, a book. I've helped Aiden Aslan write it. Now, Aiden Aslan was a British lad from Nottinghamshire. He comes to Ukraine. He joins the Ukrainian army. He's in the Ukrainian Marines, and he is captured in Mariupol. He is not Azov. There's two steelworks in Mariupol. He was at the Illich Steelworks with the Ukrainian Marines. He was captured. And the moment someone sees his British passport, he's punched on the nose. The Russians know exactly who he is, and they give him to their quizzling Ukrainian allies who populate this joke state recognized by North Korea and Syria called the Donetsk People's Republic. And he is beaten unconscious and stabbed. And this torture means that he's used as a propaganda toy. Down the track, he's sentenced to death. And a book is called Putin's Prisoner. It's out on July 20th, but it documents what happens to him. And there's a friend of mine who's doing who's Ukrainian, who has interviewed, she's a filmmaker, and she shot a film with Aiden for Penguin or for somebody else. And she says, actually, what happened to Aiden wasn't that bad. It was like he was beaten senseless, so he lost consciousness, and he was stabbed. So, I mean, and by the way, I know that's true because I've interviewed lots of other people, and certainly the tortures they used in Chechnya were terrible. So the thing is, the reason why the Ukrainians want to liberate all of Ukraine is if they don't, then there are some of their brothers and sisters who will be subject to torture or rape or castration. And you cannot, no civilized human being can be comfortable with that option. And I kind of want to say, to people like this, okay, so you think some kind of peace deal with Putin is going to work because you think he's reliable, and you think it's good that there will be people who are stuck inside Greater Russia who are Ukrainian, who could be castrated or raped or shot or killed, but that's fine. That's fine for you because you think that's good. Then there's something wrong with you.
Mm. And I've had this, there was a period, I've blocked it now because it's not great for mental health, but there was a period where I was trying to tackle Mr. Hitchens about, the Russian narratives he was repeating. And I genuinely don't believe he's getting paid for this. So he's not one of those agents or assets. I mean, he's genuinely a useful idiot. But tackling one in particular was this idea of Russian speakers being repressed in the East. And that one still does the rounds. And no matter how much you explain, like, I have spoken to Russian speakers from Mariupol. I've spoken to them in Russian, and I can tell you this is bullshit. I mean, but it still sticks in some quarters.
I speak, I did Russian at school, so when I talk to people, I speak Russian. Nobody minds. But that's the minor thing. What Hitchens does is he comes up with a whole series I mean, he talked to me about Lord Lansdowne and 1916, and like, so what's 1916 got to do with Vladimir Putin and his aggression? By the way, I see we've only got about 20 minutes left, or something like this. You mentioned something about the BBC. What were you going to ask me?
Yes. Well, this is one of the reasons. I mean, I'm not a journalist, nor am I a historian academic. But I did study Russian.
You drive a cab?
I'm one of the enemy. I do commercial propaganda marketing.
Yeah, well,
as I describe, I sell shit to people for money they don't have. Yeah, shit they don't need for money they don't have. But it's a form of brain hacking. You have to get inside the nuances of language people use in search engines and then reverse engineer that to try and sell them something. So that was, that combined with my interest in the digital techniques that are being used to weaponize social media. And dare I say it, this will annoy some of my audience here, but since 2016, believing that there were active measures in place in the US and the UK to try and hack our institutions, try and destroy credibility of our institutions.
What that's a fact. I mean,
and frustration with the BBC, dare I say it. At that point, I started to get disengaged from BBC output because I felt, at best, it wasn't addressing the real issues, and at worst, it was repeating some of the worst narratives.
So I love the BBC. The BBC has helped entertain and educate and inform me my entire life. And I worked there for 17 years. And I had some very, very, very happy times. But it ended badly when I was secretly filmed by a supporter of Tommy Robinson, a woman who had actually been threatened by his supporters because he'd fallen out with him. And then I was wining and dining her. As a BBC reporter, I can't give her any money, but I can wine and dine her. And also it was a kind of display of confidence. When you're doing this kind of stuff, like this woman was a Nazi or a neo-Nazi. She had swastika earrings. I found that out later. She wasn't wearing them when I met her. But part of what you do to try and get these people on side is you have to cozy up to them. You can't meet neo-Nazis in a meeting room over a glass of mineral water. Anyway, as a result, Tommy Robinson did a film showing me drinking too much. I believe he gave this woman £7,000. And honestly, to get a film of me drinking too much, you could do that for nothing.
Buy you a couple of bottles of wine, surely.
Yes, but Tony Hall, the then Director General, hated it, and they got rid of me. But that happened. I still pay the licensee. The BBC is a good thing. However, I did have a serious problem with the way the BBC Moscow office ran its operation. I had a problem with Steve Rosenberg is a nice man, but I think that he did not tell the truth about Russia. And the BBC Ukrainian service people used to come to me and say, John, you're the only one. So the Panorama, remember, I'm based in London, so it's easier for me to do this. But there was a problem with the BBC Moscow Bureau. And what happened to me in particular was that when we made our film Taking on Putin, which was about Team Navalny, and various people who were anti-Putin, or one of them was tasered and stabbed, another Navalny supporter was beaten over the head with an iron bar. Navalny himself poisoned, now in prison, obviously. And at one point we filmed Andrei Soldatov, who's a very good man. He's now in London.
He's on the channel. People should check that out. I've interviewed him. He's phenomenal.
He's a great guy. And anyway, we interviewed him. And as we were interviewing him, we got a phone call saying the Moscow police want to interview me and Seamus McCracken, our cameraman. And we've got the rushes of the Soldatov interview. And I don't want to go into a police station with those rushes. No, they're tiny, they're on the film card. So I said, let's go to BBC Moscow. We'll go there and drop off the rushes, and then we'll go to the police station. It's the ethical thing to do. And the bureau chief is away. The stand-in is Will Vernon, who is Steve Rosenberg's mainstream producer. And Will Vernon isn't there, he's in Siberia, but he takes the call on his mobile, and it's on speaker. And because the people who run the bureau in the absences, they say, no, we don't want to do this. And Vernon says, take your rushes and get out of the bureau. And that happened.
That's insane.
And I left the rushes with a Russian who's a friend of mine. And then I went into the police station, and I was detained for the afternoon. And the police took a photocopy of my passport, and guess what? My passport appeared on Telegram. And Seamus is good, so we both had to cancel it. And the moment I left the police station, several hours later, after a lot of nonsense, we were doorstepped by Patsy Kremlin TV. I was in a bad mood. So I gave this idiot reporter from Russian TV a lick with a rough edge of my tongue, and Seamus filmed him on his camera, and the Russian media ran away from us. But the lasting memory of that was that Will Vernon, effectively, I thought, had been captured by the Kremlin's propaganda machine, and rather than help a BBC colleague, went out of his way to make our lives far more dangerous and more dangerous for our sources.
And probably worried about getting access to officials, worried about being able to carry on their work, which is the same with Alexa Vindictive and the sort of hybrid media beast that Putin managed to create.
So it's important to have a right of reply or to reflect it. So I think that they thought that I was jeopardizing their work, and therefore they weren't willing to back me at all, because and that was their argument. The problem was down the track that the BBC bosses sided with Vernon and not me on this issue, in a way which I found infuriating. And also the big picture is that if you watch Steve's reporting, you would have been surprised when Putin invaded Ukraine over the peace, over the, let's say, over the, I don't know how long he's been there, but he's been there for at least a decade. If you watch my panoramas or my reporting from the first radio documentary I did about the Russians' use of torture in Chechnya, the film about Litvinenko, the film about the Russian Olympics, and then the appalling treatment of Navalny, you would have completely got it.
Yeah.
That there is no, and therefore, I think the BBC Russia service was compromised somehow, either by the Russian secret state or by its need to stay inside, working in Russia, to an extent that they compromised journalism.
Or, but even you see this in academia as well. And by
the way, that's a big allegation, and because of the nature of this podcast, people should be open to the possibility that I have lots of bees in my bonnet. I do have lots of bees in my bonnet, but I do not think that for Will Vernon to say to me, take your film cards and get out of here, was right and proper. And I do not think it was right and proper for BBC management to side with him rather than me. And that happened.
And of course, the person you're interviewing is a verified expert. It's not you're out on the street interviewing some nut job.
And he would have got into trouble if they'd caught that stuff on us. But the problem is, what I'm trying to address here is the thinking, the mindset. I thought when that happened, I thought it'd be far better for the BBC Russian service to be based in Riga, or at least you could. And my friend, Professor Donald Rayfield, has written this wonderful book called Stalin and His Hangmen. But he says the same thing. And he said this in 2018, that the BBC Russia service has been compromised. By the way, hats off to people like Jeremy Bowen and Clive Murray for their reporting from Ukraine, because their war reporting from Ukraine is brilliant. But what we're talking about is in the decade running up to the war, when Putin clearly was becoming more and more fascistic. And I was allowed to call, I was allowed to say, Navalny could say Russia is a police state, but I couldn't say that Putin was fascist. And actually he was.
And it's not, it's not unique to the BBC. A lot of academics have either had their organizations penetrated, or they've had awards, prizes, events. They've had all the sort of gifts and perks which have, put undue influence on them, or they've just gone native,
And politicians. So let's have a look. So in 2005, Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson, goes to Siberia with Nat Rothschild and Oleg Deripaska. Then in 2008, Mandelson and George Osborne go on Deripaska's yacht. Deripaska is a gangster. He's been sanctioned by the Americans for his connections with organized crime. And everybody knew that. Now, by the way, the Americans sanctioned him later, but everybody who knew anything about Russia would have avoided Deripaska like the plague, but not these two. And they're powerful people in British politics. What happens is that as the heat from Moscow, from the Kremlin, gets worse, the taking money from Deripaska or people really close to Putin becomes wrong. And so what you have is an outer circle of Russian oligarchs who are not visibly close to Putin. And they're the people, for example, who fund the conservatives. Because these are really anti-Kremlin oligarchs. Stop there. There is no such thing as an anti-Kremlin Russian oligarch. They are all pro-Kremlin, because if they're not, they're dead.
It's a puppet show, isn't it? Including the parliament and all the other institutions. It's a
complete fucking puppet show. So the big anxiety, when the big war happens, Boris Johnson is good, and the Ukrainians love him for it. And the great thing is he symbolizes, we're on your side, and it mattered, and that was good. The problem is in the run-up to the war, again and again and again, Boris is on the side, effectively, of the Russians against Ukrainians. And he's got a relationship with Alexander Lebedev. Alexander Lebedev was in the KGB from 1988, and he left when?
Well, you never leave the KGB, right?
Yes. So that's your очень хорошо. Very good, very good. Vladimir Putin himself has said, you cannot leave the special services. Now, what's the quote? Do you know the precise quote in Russian?
No, I don't know it word for word. I'll probably just mangle it.
But it's like Hotel California.
Yeah.
You check out anytime you want, but you can never, ever leave. So officially, Alexander Lebedev left the KGB in 1992. Did he? Did he really? I don't think so. I think he still swims in that river. And he's the guy who hosts these bunga bunga parties in the Palazzo Terranova in Umbria. His idiot son is is around. His name is Yevgeny, or rather his new title is Baron Siberia. Okay, there's a clue there, folks, in the name. So Baron Siberia is Boris Johnson's official friend, but he's an idiot. When he interviewed Lukashenko, the pig farmer dictator of Belarus, and my friend Natalia Antelava,
Tarakan, I think they call him locally.
Yes, well, also, but he was a pig farmer. But my friend Natalia Antelava was there also because Yevgeny was doing something with Newsnight, and they sent Natalia along to keep an eye on Yevgeny. And Yevgeny asks Lukashenko, "What's your view of group sex?" What? So I mean, the guy is a child. Natalia thought, this guy's got no substance. The important figure is not the boy. The important figure is Alexander Lebedev, KGB spy from 1988 to ... And Boris's relationship with the Lebedevs is frightening because when he was foreign secretary, he was one of the people who was sorting out NATO's response to the Skripal poisonings. He goes to Brussels, and he goes from Brussels, and the next place he's seen is Perugia Airport, because he's going back on a flight to London, having been to a bunga bunga party thrown by the Lebedevs. Did anyone ask him what NATO's going to do? i.e., are they going to throw the Russians off the economic system, the SWIFT banking system? Or are they going to expel a lot of diplomats? They expelled a lot of diplomats. Mm. So there's now, of course, Boris Johnson denies any wrongdoing. The KGB deny any wrongdoing. The Lebedevs say that they're victims of Russophobia. That's nonsense.
But this is my big worry to sort of look at where this is going in the long term. Some of the Kremlin's lies are, so apparent to people that, they won't forgive them for now. But as soon as Ukraine is victorious, as soon as the next regime in Russia, the next set of sort of parasites or mosquitoes land to get their fill of blood, they will, I fear, try to make some cosmetic changes, and there'll be only too many people, including the mainstream media, dead keen to line up and whitewash any new Russian regime and start trading in the kind of fashion you talk about and use these sort of outer layers and individuals and whatever. And that whole system will perpetuate itself into another generation.
Well, so the question is what happens next, and what you've done just outlined there is the most likely sequence of events, which is gloomily pessimistic and probably more likely. My view is that we should play tough with Russia until Russia is led by a Willy Brandt figure who has the moral courage to go to Mariupol and the other mass graves and say, and get down on his knees and say, we are sorry. And also we're paying to rebuild Ukraine. And I think it's nonsensical that at the moment the West is sitting on $300 billion of Russian gold, which is they put in the West for their own reasons, and that money should be in the hands of Ukraine as we speak. One of the things I'm trying to do with my life is I'm trying to become a Liberal Democratic MP, because I think neither Labour or Conservatives both of them were morally responsible for creating a climate in which Putin could launch this big war. And I want to burn down Londongrad before Moscow and the Kremlin burns down London, or the city of London, and the British economy, because of Londongrad, which is where Russia hides its dirty money, is rotting capital of our country and our country, Britain, from within.
Which constituency are you going for? Because, of course, Ed Lucas is going for the Westminster ward.
No, I'll go somewhere. I want to go somewhere lots of really good, somewhere in the countryside. It's down to them, not to me. But hopefully somewhere with lots of nice cider and deer parks and everything.
Fantastic. Well, we've got Layla Moran in my local constituency, so I am blessed to actually already have a Lib Dem MP.
Yes. So I'm anyway. I don't want to listen.
Yeah, that's a sidetrack. Yeah.
Yeah. Ben Wallace and Johnny Mercer have been brilliant, and good on them. And Liam Byrne, the Labour MP, has been brilliant in terms of calling Londongrad libel actions to account, as a Bob Seeley, as a David Davis. So part of the attraction of the Liberal Democrats is because of Trump is so loathsome about his political opponents, there are very, very, very good people who understand how bad Russia has been, who are conservative and Labour. So I don't want to make a political point about it here. But I think the Liberals have got less dirty linen than the other big parties. That's a fact. Still, now I'm going to run out of batteries soon, so
That's fine. We probably should wind up on a.
But we should have a thought. It shouldn't be about British politics. It should be about how. Ask me, maybe, if you want to. How does the war end?
That's one which historians who I often speak to loathe that question, but I think it's a good one because there seems to be still wishful thinking, pinning hopes onto Russian heroes, onto the so-called liberals. If you speak to most Ukrainians, they will, gag at that thought. So you have the Ukrainian version, which is Ukraine is a fortress, is the new bastion of democracy, and you built a freaking high wall to keep the Russians out. And then there's wishful thinking on the West. Between those two extremes, where do you think we'll land? And also the third option, of course, which is Z patriots, turbo nationalists, and a new, even more extreme Russian fascism. I don't know where you land on that.
Well, that's the great anxiety, because the great anxiety is goodbye Putin, and then like no more Mr. Nice Guy, whatever. My view is that the money in Russia is upset and angry because of this stupid war. The money used to be able to park its money, its ill-gotten gold in Londongrad. That's becoming more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult. Number two, they used to send their bastard spawn to Eton and Winchester. That's becoming more difficult. And they used to park their yachts in the south of France. And all Russia doesn't like the fact that they can't go on holiday to Cyprus, to France, da, 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 da. And that, I believe, should continue until there is a good Russian leader who says, we are sorry and we are paying to rebuild Ukraine. And so if a turbo nationalist pops up, we'll say, well, listen, okay, the sanctions continue, everything continues until you come up with somebody better than this. And we've got to be tough about that. Because in part because the Chinese will be watching. But I think that I'm confident that the Ukrainian army, when the time is right, will launch its counteroffensive. And when that happens, they will go through the Russian army like a knife through butter. And that Putin's days are numbered. The Russians don't like their czars to lose wars. And when they do, bad things happen to them. And so there's a history of all of that. But in the future, where you have to judge this is, we must support Ukraine liberate itself. That is the primary objective of the West. And if we go down this rabbit hole as, well, like the consequences may be bad. Yeah, they may well be bad, but we don't know that for certain. But actually, what's worse right now than Vladimir Putin staying in power? Because I believe, and there is some evidence for this, but the evidence has not been properly examined because nobody in power has wanted to examine it. But I believe that Brexit was a Kremlin goal. And I believe the Russian dark state worked towards Brexit in the way that the American intelligence community completely accepts that Donald Trump was elected in part by the efforts of the Russian secret state. And then there's the wars, the war in Chechnya, the war in Georgia, the war in Syria, and then 2 wars in Ukraine. So, okay, I can't see a Russian leader who is worse than Putin at the moment. And to say, oh, Putin's Mr. Nice Guy, is to understand the fact that, Vladimir Putin isn't a killer, Jonathan. He's a serial killer.
Psychotic serial killer.
It's like negotiating with Fred West. I think the patio's a bit uneven. Could you do it again? No. So, so the simple, clear thing we have to do is help free Ukraine. And then we have to say to the Russians, you've got to, if you want to come to our countries on holiday, if you want to trade with us, then you have to believe in the rule of law, and you have to say sorry to the Ukrainians in a serious way, and you have to pay them an awful lot of money for the terrible damage that you've done. And like the Germans after the Nazis, you have to be humble. Now, what effect that has on the Russian psyche, I don't know, but frankly, I don't care, because it's beyond. And the other thing, this is also a message to the Chinese, because the other great thing the Ukrainians have done is they have sent the Chinese a message, which is, do not upset the democratic bear. Because actually, although we've been slow, and listeners will be able to hear my anger at the beginning, it's also true that everybody, all the big figures in the West, have stuck together, and far too slowly, but they have done it. They are supplying Ukraine with their good Western logistical kit, and that's good. So the other way of seeing, or a good positive way of seeing this, is that China is, I think, far less keen on invading Taiwan, although, Xi would love to if he could. But he's worried about sanctions, and he's worried about a free Taiwan fighting back like the Ukrainians are. And he's worried about all of us saying, well, we stand with Taiwan.
It raises the price. It raises the cost of aggression. And that's something we didn't show to Putin until last year.
Yes. So the point is this, is that after 45, the settlement was, do not invade another country unless you've got a bloody good reason. Now, Sierra Leone, I was there, and I thought it was entirely just for the British and American Marines to try and get rid of the hand choppers in Sierra Leone, and I was there in Kosovo. I'd seen what Saddam had done to the Kurds, but I now realize that, that the invasion of Iraq was a mistake. And the reason it was a mistake is because it made Putin's case easier. Because from now on, the policy must be simple. Democracies must not invade other countries. And we need to get the tyrants to understand that too. And so the best way of forcing China to a road of at least to the road of the best we can ask from the Chinese at the moment, the Chinese Communist Party, is acceptable behavior. And they're not doing that internally, but do not invade Taiwan. My battery will go to sleep soon.
That's it. We should probably give our greeting to Vladimir Putin. I should say my thanks to you, John, as well, for a fantastic conversation, which I've been, essentially looking forward to for many, many months now. This is a huge pleasure to speak to you. Well, let's give the traditional greeting to Vladimir Putin.
I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it in English. You can do it in Russian.
Vladimir Putin, иди нахуй.
Vladimir Putin, do fuck off.
Well, that got the video demonetized right there. We'll keep it in. John, thank you so much, and Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini, and folks, my two books, Killer in the Kremlin, and coming soon, Putin's Prisoner.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll put links to those and, of course, to the Eastern Front premiere that's coming up.
Thank you.